For most of human history, gravity was a tyrant. It pressed down on every stone lifted, every structure dreamed of, every attempt to rise beyond the limits of stacked earth. Civilizations wished to build higher, wider, stronger, but gravity always answered with the same brutal simplicity: collapse. Walls bowed outward, ceilings sagged inward, and the moment a roof attempted to stretch too far across empty space, the unseen force pulled it down with merciless precision. And yet, in the middle of this ongoing struggle, there came a moment, quiet, almost accidental, when humanity realized that perhaps gravity was not the enemy. Perhaps gravity could be persuaded, redirected, even harnessed. It was the moment when the first true arch appeared, not as decoration, not as ornament, but as a structure that seemed to defy nature. It was the moment the world changed forever. Welcome to this long-form exploration of ancient engineering, where we uncover the hidden stories behind the technologies that shaped civilizations. Today, we journey deep into the origins of the arch, a simple curve that allowed humans to stop fighting gravity and instead work with it. If you enjoy historical storytelling and want to follow this 30-day series of ancient innovations, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue making these detailed, cinematic episodes for curious minds around the world. Long before Rome claimed the arch as its signature, long before stone bridges stretched across river valleys, and long before aqueducts marched triumphantly across ancient landscapes, early humans understood one truth: building meant survival. Shelters kept out cold winds, walls protected from predators, and shared structures held communities together. Yet these structures were always limited by one fundamental constraint: how far one could span a gap. A covered space wider than a few feet was a dangerous gamble. The horizontal beams placed across openings would crack under their own weight, and stone slabs were too heavy and brittle to stretch far without failing. Ancient engineers could build upward, yes, but not outward. They could stack stones into towering mounds, but they could not create vast interior spaces. To dream of plazas, halls, and monuments was to dream of structural rebellion. And so humanity searched, experimented, and failed. Over and over again, collapsed structures became the silent instructors of early architecture. Builders learned caution, narrow openings, thick walls, conservative designs. But still, they dreamed. They observed nature carefully. They watched as tree branches arched gracefully, distributing weight through curved forms. They looked at the way riverbanks held firm when shaped into bow-like curves carved by water. They saw animal rib cages holding form without breaking. They looked at caves where stone curved naturally, resisting collapse even after centuries. Everywhere they turned, the world seemed to whisper hints about a shape that could tame gravity rather than fall victim to it. In the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia and the rugged stone environments of Anatolia, stonemasons began carving small openings in curved forms. These were primitive arches, not yet fully self-supporting, often requiring wooden molds beneath them, but they revealed something astonishing. The curve, once completed, did not rely on the stone beam's ability to resist bending. Instead, it shifted the weight sideways, transferring forces into the vertical supports. Builders did not yet have the language of physics, no talk of compression, no diagrams of force vectors, but they had intuition. And intuition told them that this shape behaved unlike anything they had tried before.
As centuries passed, the arch became an increasingly deliberate choice. But its true breakthrough, the moment when it transformed from an experiment into a tool of civilization, did not arrive through theoretical innovation. It arrived through the evolution of skill. Each generation of builders inherited the knowledge of the last, shaping stones slightly more precisely, cutting angles slightly more accurately, learning to trust the shape a little more. And slowly, the arch became less a curiosity and more a symbol of possibility. People realized they could cover spaces larger than ever before. They could open entrances taller and wider, protect gates with stronger frames, and channel weight with surprising elegance. This shift, subtle at first, initiated a profound change in how humans interacted with their environment. It allowed cities to grow both outward and upward. It invited architects to imagine not just shelters, but monumental spaces capable of inspiring awe. And it set the stage for the societies that would later adopt, refine, and perfect the technology, most notably Rome, whose empire would become synonymous with the triumphant curve. But in these earliest days, the arch was still a fragile discovery. Early builders faced challenges they barely understood. A single misplaced stone could destabilize the entire structure. Rain, erosion, and poor shaping could cause sudden collapses, yet people persisted. When one arch fell, another was built, and when it held, communities gathered beneath it, marveling at the unexpected stability of a space once too wide to be covered. Imagine a small settlement in the Fertile Crescent where the first fully self-supporting arch might have been erected. It would not have looked spectacular to modern eyes, perhaps a simple passageway framed in mudbrick or stone. But to those who lived then, it represented something extraordinary. It was a gateway not just through physical space, but through the limitations of human engineering. Standing beneath it, they felt not fear, but confidence. They sensed that the structure above them did not resist gravity, it partnered with it. The downward force pressed the stones tighter together, making the arch stronger the more weight it carried. It was a revelation. This concept, structures growing stronger under stress, was unheard of in earlier architecture. Flat beams weakened under load, arches fortified themselves. It was as though the builders had stumbled upon a hidden rule of the universe, one that had always been there but remained invisible until the right minds began to observe it. And once found, it could not be forgotten. The earliest arches spread with migration, trade, and empire building. Each culture added its own interpretation. In some regions, arches remained low and wide. In others, they stretched taller, becoming elegant frames for doorways or supports for small bridges. Yet everywhere, the same silent marvel occurred. Forces once uncontrollable were now guided, shaped, and delivered safely into the ground. The weight of the world was being negotiated in stone. Later societies would mythologize their technologies, claiming divine inspiration. Some believed gods taught humans to build. Others said sacred geometry was revealed through visions or signs. Whether or not such stories held truth, one fact remained. The arch allowed humans to create spaces that felt almost sacred. To stand beneath a shape that defied collapse felt like standing beneath a miracle, and in many ways, it was. The discovery of the arch marked not just an engineering breakthrough, but an intellectual awakening. It urged people to reconsider the laws of nature and to recognize that structures didn't simply resist the world, they could channel it. The arch redirected gravity's downward pull into a harmonious flow. Instead of fighting nature, builders began cooperating with it. This shift in mindset would influence generations to come, leading to the domes of ancient temples, the vaults of cathedrals, the sweeping bridges that carried armies and traders across dangerous rivers. But all of that would come later. The story begins here, in the dusty ruins of early settlements, where the first curved passageways were shaped by hands that had no idea they were inventing the foundation of global architecture.
And so, the moment humanity tamed gravity was not marked by celebration or ceremony. It did not occur in the presence of kings or recorded in the chronicles of empires. It happened quietly, born from necessity, curiosity, and persistence. A group of ancient workers laid stones in a curve, stepped back, and realized that something impossible had occurred. The structure held. It remained standing not in defiance of gravity, but because of it. This was the beginning of a revolution, one that would take thousands of years to unfold, influencing cultures across continents, shaping skylines, and leaving behind monuments that still stand today. The arch was not just a new way to build, it was a new way to think. And this is where our story truly begins. Long before the great empires etched their names into stone, before cities rose in layers of architecture and ambition, humanity lived in a world where the environment dictated the limits of construction. Nature carved its own shapes, caves, canyons, domes of hollowed rock, while humans could only mimic these forms imperfectly. Yet it was these observations, repeated over generations of wandering tribes and early settlements, that planted the seeds of an idea. Perhaps shelter didn't need to be made entirely of straight lines. Perhaps the world itself was encouraging humanity to bend, curve, and experiment. As the Earth's earliest builders watched the landscape, they noticed something remarkable. The most durable natural forms were rarely straight. The rib cage of an animal, the overhang of a cliff, the arc of a rainbow, even the branches of trees bent gently under the weight of leaves and wind. Curves seemed to endure stress more gracefully than sharp angles humans carved. When storms battered coastal cliffs, the carved natural arches remained, while brittle projections shattered. When rivers eroded their banks, the resulting shapes resembled sweeping crescents rather than rigid walls. Nature was teaching, even then, through silent demonstration. In these early centuries, structures were simple. Mud brick walls, timber roofs, and stone shelters defined the homes of early human communities. A typical doorway was nothing more than two vertical pillars supporting a horizontal lintel. This familiar shape, still recognizable today, was limited by the material itself. Wood bowed, stone cracked, and the wider the opening grew, the more likely the structure was to fail. Builders compensated by thickening walls, shortening spans, and lowering ceilings. But humans have always been curious, always restless. If nature could form stable curves, why couldn't they? The earliest attempts at curved construction were tentative and fragile. In Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions, where clay and mud brick were abundant, builders shaped bricks into slight arcs and placed them over small openings, cellars, storage pits, animal enclosures. These proto-arches lacked the precise geometry needed for true structural harmony, but they hinted at something promising. Even without perfect symmetry, even without finely cut stones, the curved arrangements distributed forces differently. While many of these early attempts collapsed under stress, a few held long enough to inspire further experimentation. Trial and error was the teacher of antiquity. When a crude arch collapsed, it became a lesson. When a curved passageway remained standing through a season of rain and wind, it became a beacon of possibility. Over time, masons learned that the key to a stable arch was not just the curve itself, but the relationship between each of its components. A true arch was not a single piece, but a collective. Multiple stones or bricks, each shaped and positioned to transfer weight into its neighbors. Together, they formed a unity stronger than any individual block.
Central to this evolution was the understanding of the keystone, the final stone placed at the apex of the curve. Early builders didn't call it a keystone, nor did they understand its physics in the modern sense, but they recognized its power. Without that central piece, the arch was nothing more than a pile of angled stones waiting to fall inward. With it, the arch transformed into a locked and self-supporting structure. The keystone was the silent commander that unified the forces pressing downward and outward, stabilizing the entire form. As this knowledge spread, the diversity of arch shapes began to grow. Some early cultures created low, wide arches for stability. Others experimented with taller curves, seeking elegance as much as strength. In regions where stone was scarce, mud brick arches became common. In rocky terrains, stones were shaped with increasing precision, each block carefully crafted to fit the next. But regardless of style or material, the principle remained constant. The arch worked because every piece was pushing on every other piece, creating a harmony of compression. This was a turning point in human engineering. The arch represented a shift from resisting nature to working alongside it. Instead of trying to fight gravity, builders learned to guide it. The downward force that once threatened to break structures apart now flowed through the arch like water through a channel, dispersing safely into the supporting pillars and the ground beneath. It was a relationship built on balance, not opposition. Consider the experience of an ancient mason who had spent years stacking bricks for walls and constructing simple rectangular doorways. Imagine the awe he must have felt the first time he stepped back from a completed arch, a structure that seemed to hang in impossible suspension, stones pressing together so naturally that they formed a single, unified shape. For the first time, he could walk beneath a span that felt lighter than it looked, more spacious than any straight-lined structure could have offered. The arch was not merely a tool, it was a revelation that expanded the boundaries of imagination. Connectivity played an essential role in the arch's spread across early civilizations. As cities formed along rivers and trade routes, knowledge became currency. Travelers carried stories of unusual buildings and new construction methods. Skilled laborers moved from one region to another, bringing techniques that blended with local traditions. By the time the arch appeared in the architectural vocabulary of cultures across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, it had already begun its quiet transformation from innovation to foundation. Yet the arch was still fragile in these early stages. Builders lacked standardized tools for measurement. The precision required for a perfect curve was difficult to achieve with rough stone and rudimentary shaping instruments. Many arches failed during construction. Some collapsed unexpectedly years after completion. But every failure deepened the collective understanding of this remarkable structure. Each generation refined the curve, improved the angle of each stone, and learned the importance of stable foundations. The arch's earliest uses were humble. It framed doorways, strengthened storage rooms, and supported drainage channels. But these small successes hinted at much larger possibilities. If an arch could support a doorway, perhaps it could support a bridge. If it could span a small room, perhaps it could span a hall. The limits began to stretch. The ambition of builders grew alongside their confidence. In time, the arch would reach heights and spans unimaginable to its earliest inventors. It would become the backbone of aqueducts, the silhouette of temples, and the symbol of empires. But in these early centuries, it was still a silent teacher. Every curve laid by hand was part of a greater discovery. Every stone pressed into place was a step toward something monumental. The birth of the arch was not sudden. It was not the invention of a single person or the achievement of a single culture. It was the product of countless attempts across countless years, shaped by necessity and inspired by observation. It evolved slowly, like a language developing its grammar, until it became a fully formed expression of human ingenuity. As ancient builders continued to refine this new architectural language, they began to realize its greater potential. The arch did not simply cover space, it opened it. It allowed buildings to breathe, expanded the size of communal structures, and enabled societies to gather in ways they never could before. Open halls, sheltered plazas, and wide gateways became possible. Cities began to feel less constrained and more expansive. This shift in architecture had a profound impact on culture. Where once people gathered in cramped rooms, they now stood beneath open curves that invited light, airflow, and movement.
Public spaces grew larger. Ceremonial spaces became more dramatic. Even the rhythm of daily life changed as architecture shifted from confinement to openness. What began as a technical discovery was becoming a cultural transformation. And yet, as impressive as these early arches were, they remained only a precursor to what would come next. The technology was promising, but not yet perfected. The true potential of the arch still slept beneath the weight of unrealized possibility. It needed a civilization bold enough, wealthy enough, and ambitious enough to adopt it on a scale never before imagined. That civilization was rising slowly on the Italian peninsula. Rome was watching, learning, absorbing, and soon Rome would take the humble arch, refine it to precision, and unleash it across continents. What began as a survival tool in ancient villages would become the signature of an empire. The birth of the arch had sparked a quiet revolution. In the next chapter, that revolution becomes unstoppable. Long before Rome rose to greatness, the Italian peninsula was a mosaic of cultures: Etruscans, Greeks, Latin tribes, each leaving behind fragments of engineering knowledge. These fragments were like scattered pieces of a puzzle waiting for a mind ambitious enough to assemble them. When Rome's rise began, it inherited not only land and power from its neighbors, but also ideas. Ideas that would fuel its obsession with reshaping the physical world. Among these ideas was a growing fascination with the arch, a structure still modest in scale, but quietly promising a revolution. Early Roman builders did not yet understand how profoundly this curved form would transform their future. At first, the arch was simply one tool among many, adopted cautiously for small gateways and drainage channels. But Rome was not a civilization that stayed cautious for long. Its leaders sought permanence, expansion, and grandeur. They imagined cities not of wood, but of stone, not of small structures, but of monumental landscapes. And the more they dreamed, the more one truth became clear: the arch was the key. Rome's obsession with expansion began with infrastructure. Roads, walls, and public buildings were necessary not only for daily life, but also for projecting authority. The expanding republic depended on structures that could withstand centuries of storms, earthquakes, and war. Timber beams rotted, stone lintels cracked under their own weight. Rome needed a structure that defied decay, a structure that could support the ambitions of an empire still in its infancy. It was during this period that Roman engineers began studying the arch with a seriousness far beyond earlier civilizations. They refined measurements, standardized construction techniques, and introduced precision cutting. They experimented with different shapes, materials, and methods of assembly. But Rome's most transformative innovation was not the arch itself, it was concrete. Roman concrete, a mixture of lime, volcanic ash, and aggregate, cured into a material so resilient that many of its structures still stand today. With concrete, the arch was no longer limited by the size of stones or the availability of perfectly carved blocks. Now, arches could be cast in molds, shaped into vaults, stretched into bridges, and multiplied into aqueducts that climbed across entire regions. One can imagine the awe a young Roman engineer must have felt the first time he stood beneath an arch, not of individual stones, but of one continuous cast form. It was smoother, stronger, and more adaptable than anything built before. Combined with the precision of Roman surveying tools, concrete opened the door to a new architectural world. Bridges crossed valleys previously thought impassable. Water channels spanned miles with gradients so precise that modern engineers still marvel at their accuracy. Temples expanded into larger complexes, their roofs supported by sweeping vaults instead of forests of columns. As Rome embraced these possibilities, the arch ceased to be merely a structural tool. It became a symbol of Roman identity. Every conquest, every territory claimed, and every victory celebrated pushed Rome toward ever grander constructions. The empire wanted its engineering to broadcast a message. Rome was permanent, Rome was powerful, and Rome understood forces of nature that others only feared. The Roman arch was more than a curve, it was an argument carved in stone. This ambition led to feats of construction that strained the limits of human endurance and imagination. Consider the moment the Romans first attempted a multi-tiered aqueduct, arches stacked upon arches, rising like stone staircases toward the sky. To build one arch was challenging enough. To build dozens in perfect alignment was something else entirely. Workers dug foundations deep into bedrock. Surveyors measured inclinations with water levels and bronze tools. Stonecutters shaped voussoirs, the wedge-shaped blocks, by the thousands. And above them all, the master architect envisioned how each force, each pressure, each shift of weight would flow through the interconnected structure. The result was more than just an aqueduct. It was a triumph of coordination, mathematics, and sheer determination. It carried water across valleys, nourishing cities miles away. It lifted resources, health, and prosperity to regions that had once been dependent on natural springs and seasonal rains. The arch was no longer merely supporting structures, it was supporting civilizations. Rome's obsession did not end with infrastructure. Public spaces transformed dramatically under the influence of the arch. The baths of Caracalla, with their enormous vaulted ceilings, created environments where thousands could gather beneath a single roof. The basilicas offered vast open floors where administrative, legal, and social activities could take place simultaneously. Amphitheaters like the Colosseum used repeating arches to create massive arenas capable of seating tens of thousands. These arches were not only structural, but also rhythmic, forming patterns that added aesthetic power to engineering efficiency. For the Romans, the arch was the perfect union of beauty and function. It created curves that were pleasant to the eye while upholding weight that would have crushed any straight structure. Roman architects came to view the arch as the closest thing to architectural perfection, a form that could be repeated infinitely, adapted infinitely, and improved infinitely. This growing confidence pushed them into increasingly daring projects. In the regions surrounding modern-day France, the Romans constructed bridges that spanned not just modest streams, but powerful rivers. Their foundations were driven deep into swirling waters, their arches rising above currents with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. These bridges were so well built that some, like the Pont du Gard, remained standing after 2 millennia, still balanced on the same ancient stones, still carrying the same silent testimony of Roman ambition. But the arch's story in Rome was not defined only by success. Failures played an equally important role. A misaligned arch could collapse without warning, crushing workers and delaying construction for months. Vaults that were too thin could crack under the stress of their own mass. Engineers learned the hard way that the keystone had to be precisely shaped, that the foundations had to be unyieldingly firm, and that even the slightest deviation from geometry could cause catastrophic results. Every failure sharpened their understanding. Every collapse became a lesson that strengthened future triumphs. Rome's obsession with perfection led them to solve problems that earlier builders had accepted as inevitable. They invented new scaffolding techniques, refined centering frameworks, and developed systems for transporting heavy materials across long distances. They designed standards, manuals, and guidelines that allowed massive projects to be replicated throughout the empire with remarkable consistency. A bridge in Spain resembled one in Syria. An aqueduct in Africa shared the same geometry as one in Gaul. This uniformity was no accident. It was the result of an empire that approached engineering with scientific rigor. Yet even as the arch permeated every corner of Roman life, it remained more than an engineering solution. It became a cultural icon. When Roman generals returned from victory, they passed beneath triumphal arches, massive structures carved with scenes of war, conquest, and political glory. These arches did not support roofs or aqueducts. Their purpose was symbolic. They framed the sky itself as a stage for Roman greatness. To walk beneath an arch was to enter a space sanctified by triumph, a place where stone recorded the power of empire. Rome's obsession with the impossible reached its peak in the construction of monumental domes and vaults, structures that expanded the arch from a single curve into a three-dimensional marvel. The Pantheon, completed under Emperor Hadrian, remains one of the most extraordinary examples. Its dome, formed by a perfect sphere resting inside a cylinder, owed its existence entirely to the principles of the arch. Every brick was angled to push inward and downward, guiding weight around the circular form and into the supporting walls. At its center, the oculus opened to the sky, a reminder that even the heavens were not beyond Roman architectural ambition.
And yet, for all the grandeur Rome achieved, the deeper truth was this: the arch became the empire's backbone because Rome understood something fundamental. It understood that mastery over nature required cooperation, not domination. The arch worked because it aligned with the way forces naturally flowed. Rome's brilliance was in recognizing this and elevating it from craft to science, from necessity to art. By the height of the Roman Empire, the arch was everywhere. Bridges, aqueducts, baths, arenas, temples, city gates, monuments, even underground sewers. Rome had not merely adopted the arch, it had woven it into the DNA of its civilization. And in doing so, it ensured that its structures would endure long after its emperors fell, long after its legions disbanded, long after the political entity of Rome disappeared. Rome's obsession had set the world on a new architectural trajectory. The arch would survive the fall of the empire. It would travel across continents in the hands of builders who inherited Roman knowledge. It would evolve into new forms, shaping the skylines of medieval Europe and beyond. But before all of that, before the Gothic cathedrals and the Renaissance domes, the arch would reshape the daily life of ordinary Romans. It would carry water, connect cities, shelter crowds, and symbolize power. The next stage of this story is where the arch moves from innovation to empire, from idea to infrastructure, from theory to the very foundation on which Rome stood. Rome's obsession with the impossible had only just begun. By the time Rome entered its golden age, the arch was no longer an experiment. It had become the empire's most loyal servant, unshakable, obedient to mathematical laws, and capable of carrying the weight of entire civilizations. Yet the true miracle was not the arch itself, but what the arch made possible. In the shadow of its curves, Rome laid down the veins and arteries of a continent-spanning empire, building systems so vast and so efficient that even modern societies struggle to replicate them. Every bridge, every aqueduct, every vaulted hall whispered the same truth. Rome did not merely use the arch, Rome became the arch. In those centuries, cities grew at a pace previously unimaginable. Where once communities clustered near rivers and springs, Roman engineering shattered those limitations. Water could now travel miles across valleys and uneven landscapes, delivered with astonishing precision through aqueducts supported by sweeping rows of arches. These arches allowed entire cities to bloom in regions where nature had offered no generosity. To the Romans, engineering was not a response to scarcity. It was a declaration of superiority over geography. Consider the vast network of aqueducts feeding Rome itself. The city was a superstructure of human ambition. Baths, fountains, gardens, factories, and hundreds of thousands of thirsty citizens, all depending on a constant flow of clean water. For such a system to work, engineers needed not only skill, but unwavering confidence in the architecture supporting it. Each aqueduct spanned valleys with bridges so precisely aligned that water flowed at a gradient so gentle, so steady, that it could travel dozens of miles without stagnation or flooding. Every arch in these long sequences bore a piece of that responsibility. If one collapsed, the water stopped. If one shifted, the system failed. Rome's survival depended on the reliability of its arches, and for centuries they did not disappoint. Out in the provinces, Roman engineers became wandering sculptors of infrastructure, carving paths through mountains, lifting channels over gorges, and laying the groundwork for cities that would endure long after Rome's political power faded.
Local populations watched in awe as workers assembled wooden frames and poured concrete into curved molds. When the frames were removed and the arches held, it seemed almost like sorcery. Some regions whispered that Roman engineers possessed divine blessings. Others believed they had discovered secret formulas passed down from gods. But the truth was simpler and far more profound. Roman builders wielded knowledge, discipline, and a relentless pursuit of precision.
Bridges became some of the most iconic ambassadors of Roman engineering. Where natural landscapes had once fragmented societies, Rome stitched them together. Rivers no longer served as barriers, but as challenges to be conquered. Arched bridges emerged like great stone beasts across Europe and North Africa. Their strength derived not from brute force, but from the elegant distribution of weight. Travelers and merchants crossed them daily, unaware of the mathematical marvel beneath their feet. A single arch could support immense loads because every stone pushed outward and downward, transforming load into stability. This understanding allowed Rome to build bridges that would stand for millennia, surviving floods, wars, weather, and the slow grinding of time. And then there were the monumental structures, the public works that showcased Rome's mastery not only of engineering, but the human spirit. The great baths, with their cavernous vaulted halls, offered citizens spaces where air, water, and stone formed an orchestrated symphony. Heat circulated through hypocaust systems, steam rose beneath arched ceilings, and light filtered through open oculi. These buildings were not just for cleansing, they were for awe. To step inside was to feel the presence of an empire that believed comfort was not a privilege, but a craft. Markets and basilicas evolved into architectural wonders, their interiors free from restrictive columns, thanks to barrel vaults and groin vaults, complex variations of the arch that multiplied space like optical illusions. Each vault was a celebration of geometry, a demonstration that the ancient world understood structural forces with greater clarity than history often gives them credit for. The arch allowed roofs to float above bustling crowds, creating open spaces where trade, politics, and conversation became the heartbeat of daily life. In Rome's grand amphitheaters, the arch became a spectacle in itself. Repeating row after row, tier upon tier, arches formed the backbone of structures capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. Without the arch, the Colosseum could not have risen. Its corridors, stairways, and seating tiers all depended on a lattice of arches woven together into an architectural organism. Every game, every festival, every gathering of the Roman populace took place supported by the curve that had become synonymous with Roman power. The arch literally held the empire's people, elevating their collective experience beyond the mundane. But the influence of the arch extended beyond function and form. It shaped how Rome perceived itself. As the empire expanded, it erected triumphal arches in every major city, monuments not intended to hold weight or carry water, but to carry meaning. These arches commemorated victories, honored emperors, and marked the presence of Rome in distant lands. When a Roman general passed beneath an arch of triumph, he was not merely being celebrated, he was being framed within the architectural language of power. The arch transformed stone into memory, geometry into politics. On remote frontiers, Roman soldiers encountered landscapes that seemed hostile and unyielding, yet wherever they built, the arch soon followed. In Britain's rainy highlands, stone bridges reflected Roman endurance. In Syria's desert, aqueducts marched across dry plains. In North Africa's heat, massive cisterns supported by arches stored water for entire cities. The arch became a universal answer to local challenges, adapting to climates, terrains, and cultural contexts without losing its essence. For the common Roman citizen, the arch was an invisible companion. It framed their doorways, supported their roofs, connected their neighborhoods, and brought them water. It defined the skyline of their cities and the underground channels beneath their feet. Most never thought about its mechanics or marveled at its geometry.
The arch, like the air they breathed or the stones they walked upon, simply existed, constant, reliable, omnipresent. That was perhaps its greatest triumph. The highest form of engineering is not what draws attention, but what seamlessly integrates into life. The Roman arch did exactly that.
Of course, this widespread use did not come without challenges. Maintaining such an extensive network of arch-based infrastructure required constant labor. Floods eroded foundations, earthquakes cracked vaults. The relentless weight of time tested every structure. Yet the Romans did not shy away from maintenance. Using standardized repair techniques, they created teams of masons and engineers tasked with keeping arches intact. Some aqueducts were repaired dozens of times across centuries, their survival a testament to Rome's belief in preservation as much as creation. The arch also introduced a new architectural philosophy, modularity. Because arches could be repeated with predictable structural behavior, Rome could design large buildings with reusable patterns. This repetition meant faster construction, greater stability, and unmistakable Roman identity. Cities conquered by Rome quickly adopted the style, building their own vaulted baths, arched courtyards, and monumental gates. In time, the arch spread not because it was forced upon people, but because it worked. It solved problems no other structure could solve. As the empire expanded, the arch revealed another advantage: adaptability. It could be widened or narrowed, raised or lowered, built from stone or concrete, reinforced with brick or marble. It could serve as a humble doorway or elevate itself into a grand dome. This flexibility allowed Roman architecture to respond to every new challenge with confidence. A river? Build a bridge. A valley? Build an aqueduct. A public gathering? Build a basilica. A political victory? Build a triumphal arch. The solution was always the same shape, but its expression was infinitely varied. The arch did not merely hold up buildings, it held up society. It enabled commerce, sanitation, transportation, governance, and social cohesion. It allowed Rome to feed, clean, entertain, and inspire its citizens. And in doing so, it secured something no army, no treaty, no emperor could guarantee: longevity. When we look upon the remains of Roman cities today, what stands most often are the arches, the aqueduct segments, the temple entrances, the bridge foundations. Walls crumble, roofs disappear, and decorative elements erode. But the arches endure. They remain locked in place as though still supported by the hands that built them. They are the quiet survivors of a world long vanished, carrying the memory of an empire in their curves. In this chapter, we have witnessed the arch not as an isolated invention, but as the skeleton of a civilization. It transformed daily life, reshaped landscapes, empowered cities, and projected imperial authority. It became, in every sense, the structure that held up an empire. Yet Rome's love affair with the arch was far from finished. The next stage would take the simple curve and elevate it into a discipline of physics and geometry capable of reshaping human thought itself. Rome had mastered the curve, but understanding why it worked would open the door to even greater architectural wonders. This brings us to the next chapter, where we journey deeper into the hidden forces that allowed the arch not just to stand, but to stand stronger the more weight it carried. For most of history, builders did not speak in the language of physics. They did not write formulas, graph force diagrams, or calculate vectors. Yet they understood, in a profoundly intuitive way, the secret that made the arch so extraordinary. They knew that beneath every stone structure lay an invisible world of forces, pushing, pulling, compressing, dispersing, and that the difference between a structure that stood for centuries and one that collapsed within days depended entirely on how those forces were guided. The arch, more than any structure before it, was a negotiation between human intention and natural law. When Rome began building on an unprecedented scale, this negotiation grew urgent.
Structures were no longer modest or temporary. They were designed to last, to carry unimaginable loads, to stretch across ravines and rise above open spaces. Rome needed to understand not just how to build arches, but why arches worked. This unspoken question, why does a curved structure hold when a straight one breaks, became the foundation of a quiet revolution in engineering. At the heart of the arch's strength lies a phenomenon so simple that it feels like a paradox. Pressure creates stability. The more weight an arch carries, the more tightly its stones press together. In a world where nearly every material weakens under added load, the arch grows stronger. This counterintuitive behavior allowed the Romans to construct aqueducts that towered above valleys, bridges that spanned rivers, and vaults that sheltered vast public halls. And though they lacked the equations we use today, they learned to read the language of compression through experience, observation, and relentless trial.
To understand the secret physics behind the arch, imagine each stone, each voussoir, as a participant in a complex performance. None of the stones can stand alone. They lean on each other, each transmitting part of the weight to the next. Forces flow through the structure like water through a channel, moving downward and outward. As long as every stone is shaped correctly and every angle precise, the entire arch becomes a unified body resisting collapse. The keystone, sitting at the very apex, is the anchor that locks the performance into harmony. Without it, the arch has no identity, only a scatter of stones ready to fall inward. When the keystone is set, the structure becomes self-sustaining. Gravity, instead of pulling the arch apart, presses it inward, causing each stone to grip its neighbor with increasing force. In this way, the arch becomes a paradoxical marriage of fragility and strength, delicate in appearance, yet powerful in action. This understanding of compression did not emerge from abstract thought, but from centuries of observation. Roman engineers noticed that arches with shallow curves behaved differently from those with steep rises. They experimented with the angle of the stones, learning that even small deviations could alter how the load traveled through the structure. They discovered the importance of stable foundations, recognizing that an arch was only as strong as the ground beneath it. They learned to calculate these relationships not through numeric formulas, but through a body of knowledge passed from teacher to apprentice, from builder to builder. As the Romans refined their techniques, they unlocked more complex uses of the arch. The barrel vault, essentially an arch extended into a tunnel, allowed roofs to stretch across large spaces without requiring internal supports. It transformed architecture from a forest of columns into open-air halls where thousands could gather. Markets, basilicas, and bathhouses all grew into monumental interiors because the physics of the arch made them possible. Then came the groin vault, where two barrel vaults intersected at right angles. This innovation distributed weight even more efficiently, allowing architects to cover rectangular spaces with remarkable elegance. Every groin vault depended on the same principle that governed a single arch, the redirection of forces through compression. But in this new form, the forces traveled along intersecting curves, creating a lattice of support that made ceilings appear to hover effortlessly above the ground. These innovations allowed architects to dream not of simple shelters, but of vast, light-filled spaces. Sunlight streamed through clear starry windows, illuminating walls and floors that had once been dim and enclosed. Public life expanded. Art, politics, commerce, and leisure took place under the protection of arches and vaults that defied imagination. The physics behind these structures was not static. It evolved as Rome continued to experiment. When builders constructed multi-tiered aqueducts, they discovered that stacking arches created a self-stabilizing system. The weight of the upper arches pressed downward on the lower ones, increasing their compression and thus their strength. A structure made of dozens or even hundreds of arches became more stable than a massive solid wall would have been. The open spaces between the arches reduced material costs, lightened the load, and created a rhythmic aesthetic that defined Roman architecture.
In bridges, the physics became even more profound. Flowing water exerted enormous pressure on foundations. A straight beam would crack under such environmental stress, but an arch transferred forces safely into the ground. The outward thrust created by the arch was counteracted by the abutments, massive structures placed at either end. In essence, the entire bridge became a balance of tensions and pressures, a conversation between geometry and the natural world. This mastery of forces extended into the construction of domes. A dome is nothing more than an arch rotated around a central point, creating a continuous curve capable of spanning immense spaces. Like an arch, a dome distributes weight evenly downward and outward. But unlike an arch, the forces operate in every direction simultaneously. This required deeper understanding of material behavior and force distribution. The Romans discovered that lighter materials were needed near the top of domes, while heavier, stronger materials could form the base. This insight allowed them to construct the Pantheon, whose vast concrete domes still stands today, a testament to the silent precision of physics.
As Roman engineers refined their craft, they learned that the invisible world of forces was both predictable and manageable. They developed tools capable of measuring angles and inclinations, enabling them to design arches and vaults with consistent geometry. They created construction manuals that standardized methods across the empire. They applied mathematics not as abstract theory, but as a lived, practiced discipline. In many ways, the arch transformed Roman society not because of what it looked like, but because of what it allowed them to understand. It taught them that the world could be interpreted through patterns and principles. It taught them that stability came not from resisting nature, but from cooperating with it. And it taught them that a civilization built on such knowledge could endure long after its political power faded. Yet the physics of the arch was not merely functional, it had a philosophical dimension. To the Romans, the arch represented order, an alignment between human intention and the forces governing the universe. Buildings that once seemed impossible rose into existence because engineers understood how to guide the weight of nature itself. In a world governed by gravity, the arch whispered a quiet truth. The laws of nature were not obstacles, but opportunities. The deeper the Romans explored this knowledge, the more daring their architecture became. They pushed arches to greater heights, longer spans, and more complex configurations. They created networks of interconnected arches that formed entire structural systems capable of supporting vast cities. They built roads, bridges, aqueducts, theaters, and temples and palaces, all based on the same elegant principle of compression. And with each new structure, they gained confidence. The arch became the backbone of an empire, not only physically, but intellectually. It shaped how Romans thought about craft, science, and even destiny. It showed them that the world could be understood through reason, observation, and relentless refinement. In the arch, they found a metaphor for their own civilization, a system of disparate parts held together by shared purpose. By the time Rome reached its architectural zenith, the arch was more than a tool. It was a world view. It had taught humanity that structures could grow stronger under pressure, that forces could be redirected rather than resisted, and that beauty and strength did not need to exist apart. The arch was the first architectural form to achieve harmony between art and physics. As we look back today, the arch's secret seems obvious, but in its time it was nothing less than revolutionary. It reshaped landscapes, empowered cities, and gave birth to some of the greatest architectural achievements in history. And its principles, those ancient insights into force, balance, and compression, continue to guide modern engineering. Even skyscrapers and suspension bridges owe part of their lineage to the humble arch. But the story of the arch does not end with physics. After all, architecture is not merely about structure. It is about meaning. In the next chapter, we explore how the arch transformed from a functional tool into a cultural symbol, becoming a storyteller in stone, a monument to victory, ambition, and identity. By the time Rome had mastered the physics of the arch, the structure had already reshaped cities, empowered armies, and carried rivers across continents. Yet something even more profound was beginning to happen, a transformation beyond engineering. The arch was evolving from a tool of construction into a symbol of meaning. It became more than stone and geometry. It became narrative. It became memory. It became a language through which empires spoke to their people and to the centuries yet to come. To walk through a Roman city was to walk through a gallery of arches, each one offering a silent message. Some carried water, some supported roofs, but others, perhaps the most important, carried stories. These were the triumphal arches, massive stone monuments carved with scenes of war, diplomacy, mythology, and imperial grandeur. Unlike aqueducts or bridges, triumphal arches bore no functional burden. They did not transport or support anything. Their purpose was entirely ideological. They framed the sky itself as though the heavens were the eternal stage on which Rome acted. The origins of these symbolic arches trace back to Rome's deep-rooted belief that power needed to be seen to be understood. Victories were not simply events, they were opportunities to reinforce the idea of Roman destiny. When a general returned from conquest, the city erupted in celebration. The triumphal procession, a spectacle of musicians, banners, trophies, and captives, moved through the streets until it passed beneath a monumental arch erected in the general's honor. Walking beneath that curve was not merely ceremonial, it was a transformation. It represented the crossing from mortal achievement to immortal legacy. The arch became a gateway between human experience and imperial mythology. These triumphal arches were carefully designed to embody Roman identity. Relief carvings wrapped around their facades, illustrating victories in vivid detail. Legions marching in perfect formation, enemy kings bowing, deities offering blessings, chariots rolling forward with divine authority. Every image carved into the stone told a chapter of a larger story, the story of Rome's unbroken ascent. The arch served as both a monument and a narrative, preserving moments of glory that Rome demanded the world remember. Yet even beyond military victory, arches became symbols of civic pride. In cities across the empire, arches marked major roads, public squares, and the entrances to great buildings. Their presence announced importance. They became thresholds into spaces meant for commerce, justice, worship, or celebration. To step beneath an arch was to enter a realm endowed with significance. The curve formed a natural frame, inviting the eye to focus, inviting the mind to interpret. Even without inscriptions or carvings, an arch communicated something essential. Here, something meaningful begins. This shift from engineering to storytelling represented a profound evolution in human architectural expression. Before the arch, buildings were primarily functional. They sheltered, stored, or protected. With the arch, buildings began to express ideas. Architecture became a medium not merely for habitation, but for communication. The arch's shape itself was a message, strong yet elegant, simple yet profound, engineered yet organic. Rome embraced this duality, embedding the arch into every layer of its cultural identity. But this symbolic use of the arch was not confined to Rome. Across the empire, local communities adapted arches to carry their own stories. In the eastern provinces, arches were decorated with intricate floral motifs inspired by local traditions. In North Africa, arches incorporated desert stone and regional patterns. In Gaul, arches blended Roman engineering with Celtic artistry. Each region used the Roman arch as a foundation, then layered upon it the distinct colors and textures of their own heritage. The arch became a canvas for cultural fusion. Even within Rome, no two arches told the same story.
The Arch of Titus depicted the sacking of Jerusalem, complete with carvings of stolen treasures and victorious soldiers. The Arch of Constantine celebrated a military triumph through a patchwork of sculptures borrowed from earlier monuments, stitching together the visual history of past emperors. These arches were not only architectural marvels, they were historical documents carved in stone.
But beyond the political and cultural symbolism, the arch carried a deeper, almost spiritual resonance. Its shape, a rising curve meeting at a central apex, became associated with the idea of ascent. It symbolized the rise of the human spirit, the reaching upward toward ideals, gods, or destiny. The arch lifted the eye naturally toward the sky. In temples and basilicas, arches framed altars and sacred spaces, guiding worshippers toward the divine. In marketplaces, arches created rhythm and order, elevating commerce into a civic experience. In forums, arches framed statues of emperors, poets, and philosophers, turning public squares into theaters of collective memory. Because the arch was so deeply tied to the act of passing through, from outside to inside, from mundane to sacred, it became a metaphor for transformation. In art, literature, and ritual, crossing beneath an arch represented a journey, a progression, or an initiation. It was not merely a structural form, it was a psychological experience. The human mind responded naturally to the curve, recognizing stability and grace in its geometry. Even today, arches evoke a sense of significance and continuity because their symbolic power has been etched into our cultural memory for thousands of years. The arch also became a storyteller in a more subtle way through the spaces it created. Vaulted markets allowed merchants from distant lands to gather, their goods and stories blending into the vibrant noise of urban life. Arched bridges connected communities separated by nature's obstacles, enabling the exchange of ideas and traditions. Aqueducts brought fresh water to cities, transforming public health, agriculture, and sanitation. These were not narratives carved in stone, but narratives lived daily by millions. The arch was the silent thread weaving these experiences together. Every Roman citizen, whether they realized it or not, lived within a story crafted by arches. The city's rhythm, the way people moved, gathered, traded, and worshipped, was shaped by these curves. Arches created corridors of movement and spaces of unity. They invited people into plazas, guided them through colonnades, sheltered them in vast interiors, and lifted their gaze upward. Architecture became a form of storytelling, not through words, but through movement, light, and space. And while Rome perfected the symbolic and functional use of the arch, other cultures would later reinterpret its meaning. Medieval Europe transformed the arch into a spiritual symbol, elongating it into the pointed Gothic form that lifted cathedrals toward the heavens. Islamic architecture adorned arches with intricate geometric patterns, turning them into expressions of cosmic harmony. Renaissance architects revived Roman arches to celebrate human reason and artistic proportion. Though centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, the arch remained one of the most enduring symbols of human creativity. This endurance speaks to something fundamental about the arch. It is a shape that resonates deeply within us, a union of strength and beauty, form and function, idea and structure. Its curve invites interpretation. Its stability inspires trust. Its ancient origins connect us to the earliest moments of architectural innovation. And its presence in modern design, from bridges to stadiums to monumental gates, shows that its symbolic power has never faded. By becoming a symbol, the arch transcended architecture. It became history. It became memory. It became legacy. As we move deeper into this story, the arch continues to evolve. The symbolic arches of Rome mark a turning point where engineering meets identity, where structures become cultural storytellers. But the next chapter in this journey belongs not to Rome alone. It belongs to an age when arches climbed higher than ever before, stretching toward the heavens in a quest to bring light, space, and spirituality into perfect harmony.
This brings us into the next chapter, the moment when arches transformed into towering expressions of faith and ambition, the age of the great cathedrals. When Rome's empire finally dimmed, the world did not fall silent. It shifted. Power fractured. Cities shrank. Knowledge retreated into guarded monasteries. Stone roads cracked. Aqueducts sagged, and the grand arches of amphitheaters became shelters for shepherds and wanderers. Yet even in this age of uncertainty, the arch did not disappear. It lingered like an ember buried beneath ash, waiting for a society bold enough to breathe new life into it. And when Europe slowly awakened from centuries of upheaval, that ember ignited into a blaze of architectural ambition more radical than anything the ancient world had ever imagined. This new era was not defined by emperors or armies, but by faith. Across Europe, Christianity shaped the rhythm of life, and churches became the heart of every community. At first, builders repurposed Roman basilicas, reusing their familiar rounded arches and heavy stone walls. But as the centuries passed, desire grew for structures that could embody a spiritual ideal, buildings that did not merely shelter worship, but lifted the soul upward. The old Roman arch, strong though it was, felt heavy, grounded, too earthly. Europe wanted something that could reach higher. The pointed arch emerged not as an invention of a single architect, but as a quiet revelation. Its origins can be traced through Byzantine and Islamic architecture, where pointed arches solved structural challenges in domes and arcades. As knowledge flowed along trade routes and through the Crusades, European masons encountered this unfamiliar shape. What they found was astonishing. The pointed arch did what the Roman arch could do, but better. It directed weight more efficiently downward, reducing outward thrust. This meant walls no longer needed to be thick and fortress-like. They could rise taller, become thinner, and open themselves to light. This single transformation changed everything. The birth of Gothic architecture was not declared through proclamation, but through experimentation. In the early 12th century, at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis near Paris, Abbot Suger sought to create a space filled with what he called lux nova, new light. He envisioned a church that felt like heaven itself had descended to earth. To achieve this, builders embraced the pointed arch, testing its limits, stretching it higher and higher until the walls seemed to dissolve into air. The structure that emerged was unlike anything Europe had seen. The pointed arches rose like hands in prayer, guiding the eye toward the radiant stained glass windows that filled the walls. Light, filtered through vibrant colors, poured into the space like a living presence. For the first time, architecture did not merely enclose light, it shaped it, sculpted it, transformed it into a spiritual experience. And at the core of this transformation was the arch, no longer content to hold weight, but now holding light, space, and emotion. As masons experimented further, they discovered that combining pointed arches with ribbed vaults created an even more powerful structural system. Ribbed vaults acted as skeletal frameworks, channeling forces through slender ribs rather than massive slabs of stone. This allowed ceilings to soar to unprecedented heights. Beneath these vaults, columns became elegant clusters of stone rather than bulky supports. The building itself began to feel alive, as though its bones and limbs were reaching upward in a perpetual gesture of aspiration. But the true revolution arrived with the flying buttress. This external arch, reaching from the upper walls down to sturdy piers outside the building, countered the outward thrust created by the soaring vaults. It was a brilliant structural solution that allowed walls to become little more than translucent canvases for stained glass storytelling. The flying buttress became the signature of Gothic architecture,
turning cathedrals into sculptural landscapes of stone, space, and light.
Every innovation of this era, pointed arches, ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, was an evolution of the arch's ancient principle, guiding forces along paths that nature accepted rather than resisted. But now, these forces were being shaped in ways that directed not just physical weight, but emotional weight. The Gothic arch was an arrow pointed toward heaven, a symbol of yearning, hope, and devotion. Across Europe, cities competed to build cathedrals taller, grander, and more luminous than those of neighboring regions. Builders labored for generations, knowing they would never see their work completed. A mason might spend his entire life carving a single set of columns. An architect might begin a plan that his grandson's grandson would complete. These cathedrals were not projects, they were legacies, communal commitments that transcended mortality. Within these towering spaces, the arch became a teacher of philosophy and faith. Its upward trajectory mirrored the spiritual ascent believed to await the faithful. Its elegant shape captured a balance between earthbound material and celestial inspiration. And its presence reminded worshippers that the divine was not somewhere unreachable, but could be approached, step by step, arch by arch, through a space crafted by human hands. The people who built these structures understood the symbolic power of the arch intuitively. They felt its impact long before they articulated it. In towns where wooden houses leaned along narrow streets, the cathedral rose like a mountain of stone. Its arches were visible from miles away, guiding travelers like a beacon. They announced the presence of a community bound by shared belief, shared labor, and shared aspiration. The cathedral was the heart of civic identity, and the arch was the heart of the cathedral. Inside, arches created rhythms that shaped the movement of pilgrims and worshippers. The nave's towering arcades framed pathways that led toward the altar, reinforcing the journey from earthly concerns to spiritual contemplation. Light filtered through stained glass created shifting colors that danced across the stone floor. The architecture itself became a form of prayer, silent, immense, and enduring. Even the construction process became a ritual. Quarry workers extracted stone that had formed over millions of years. Carvers shaped it with hand tools, coaxing curves where nature had laid only straight lines. Builders lifted stones with wooden cranes powered by human muscle, setting each piece into place with the knowledge that one misalignment could undermine the entire structure. Every arch constructed was an act of faith. Faith in geometry, faith in craftsmanship, and faith in the generations yet to finish the work. As cathedrals multiplied across Europe, each city created its own interpretation of the Gothic vision. In France, cathedrals like Chartres and Amiens reached soaring heights, their facades adorned with statues that told biblical stories in stone. In England, cathedrals stretched horizontally, their long naves and fan vaults emphasizing grace and continuity. In Germany, structures like Cologne Cathedral blended verticality with intricate detailing that seemed to defy the weight of stone. Yet, despite regional differences, every Gothic cathedral shared the same structural DNA. Arches aspiring upward, channeling forces with elegance, forming skeletal frameworks both strong and delicate. The arch had evolved beyond mere function. It had become the soul of a movement that sought to elevate humanity through architecture. What made this era extraordinary was not simply the engineering skill, but the intention behind it. Rome used arches to display power. Medieval Europe used arches to express longing. The Gothic arch looked not outward to empire, but upward to the divine. And yet in its upward reach, it also lifted human creativity, ingenuity, and ambition. For the first time in history, architecture became a bridge between heaven and earth, not metaphorically, but physically. The Gothic cathedral was a mountain sculpted by human hands. Its spires pierced the sky, its vaults seemed to float, its arches created spaces where people felt small yet uplifted, humble yet inspired. This emotional and spiritual transformation of the arch marked one of the greatest cultural shifts in architectural history. It proved that engineering could be poetic, that structure could be symbolic, and that human beings could use stone and gravity to construct visions of eternity. In the centuries that followed, political upheaval, changing artistic styles, and new technologies would reshape architecture once again. But the Gothic era left behind a legacy that cannot be erased. Even today, these cathedrals stand as reminders of what humans can achieve when engineering and meaning intertwine. The arch had journeyed from tool to technology, from symbol to spirit, but its story was still far from over. Beyond the cathedral walls, the arch would soon stretch across landscapes once more, this time not in the service of empires or faith alone, but in the pursuit of connecting worlds. Next, the arch returns to the open air, forging bridges that would reshape economies, cultures, and civilizations. As the Middle Ages progressed and Europe knitted itself back together after centuries of upheaval, societies began to move, trade, and travel with renewed purpose. Towns grew into cities, markets expanded into networks, and people found themselves traversing landscapes once considered impassable. Rivers, valleys, and rugged terrain were no longer barriers to be feared. They were challenges waiting to be overcome. In this renewed age of movement, the arch took on a new role, emerging from cathedrals and cloisters to stride confidently across the open world. It became the spine of bridges that connected regions, economies, and cultures. Through these bridges, the arch became not only a symbol of stability, but a pathway to new possibilities. For ancient Rome, bridges were tools of empire, expanding territory and military reach. But in medieval and early modern Europe, bridges transformed into lifelines for trade and communication. A bridge no longer served merely as a structure to move armies. It became the heart of a community, shaping the economic rhythms and social life around it. And wherever a bridge rose, the arch was the form that made it possible. Arched bridges carried an element of poetry, graceful curves stretching across rivers, their reflections shimmering on the water's surface, forming perfect circles as though the land and sky were momentarily united. Yet behind this elegance was a profound understanding of physics. A well-built arch did what no flat stone beam could. It channeled weight into its supports without cracking under the burden of its own span. Water could rush below, storms could rage above, carts and caravans could pass endlessly across, and still the arch would hold. Consider the simple beauty of a single arched bridge crossing a quiet river. The stones of the arch, arranged in a perfect curve, pressed together so tightly that even centuries of erosion cannot easily pry them apart. The keystone at the apex locks the entire structure into harmony. At its ends, massive abutments grip the earth like anchors, absorbing the outward thrust. The bridge becomes not just a passage, but a testament to the enduring logic of compression. Yet, as societies expanded, so did their ambitions. One arch became many, stretching across rivers whose widths demanded multiple spans. These long bridges were marvels of engineering, each arch supporting the next, distributing forces over vast distances. Builders calculated not with ink and parchment, but through intuition, experience, and decades of apprenticeship. They measured angles by eye, shaped stones by hand, and trusted the ancient geometry inherited from Rome.
Among the most remarkable of these structures was the medieval bridge that didn't merely cross water, but hosted entire neighborhoods. In places like Florence, Paris, and London,
Bridges became bustling centers of life. Shops lined the sides, houses perched precariously above the flowing river, and people lived their entire lives atop a structure supported by arches. These bridges were cities suspended over water, their arches creating the foundations for human activity that pulsed throughout the day and long into the night. But even more dramatic were the bridges that crossed deep valleys or connected remote mountain regions. In these landscapes, the arch became a defiant gesture, stretching across voids where no human path had existed before. Builders erected wooden scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground, braving winds and dizzying heights to lay stones precisely in place. The construction process was as remarkable as the final structure. Masons balanced on narrow planks, hauling heavy blocks and chiseling precise curves. Every stone they placed brought them closer to the moment when the scaffolding would be removed and the arch would stand by its own strength alone. That moment, the removal of the wooden centering, was the most dramatic of all. Entire communities gathered to watch the transition. If the arch held, cheers echoed through the valley. If it failed, the collapse was spectacular and devastating. But when it succeeded, the bridge became a source of local pride, a gateway to prosperity, and a symbol of human perseverance. In some regions, arches created not just bridges, but aqueducts that doubled as elevated pathways. The same structural principles that carried water also carried people, goods, and ideas. These monumental structures stretched across landscapes like stone colonnades, linking cities to distant springs and connecting settlements that had once been isolated. Travelers walked beneath them in awe, marveling at how stone could rise so high and so gracefully. Beyond Europe, the arch expanded its influence across continents, adapting to new materials, climates, and cultures. In Asia, Persia, and parts of the Islamic world, builders merged the arch with local architectural traditions, creating bridges of breathtaking intricacy. Some featured pointed arches that recalled the soaring forms of mosques and palaces. Others incorporated decorative patterns, turning even the most utilitarian structures into expressions of beauty and identity. In the Americas, Andean civilizations such as the Inca built bridges of rope and fiber rather than stone. Yet even these designs echoed the principles of weight distribution and tension that arches embodied. Though visually different, they shared the same core understanding. The forces of nature could be guided, not fought. As trade intensified during the medieval period, bridges became more than engineering achievements. They became catalysts of civilization. Merchants crossing a bridge might find themselves in a new kingdom, a new cultural sphere, or a new network of markets. Ideas traveled as easily as goods. Languages mixed, technologies spread, and the cultural fabric of entire regions grew dense with exchange. The arch, supporting these bridges, became an engine of human connection. Bridges also shaped the destinies of cities. A well-placed bridge could transform a small settlement into a thriving hub of commerce. Inns, markets, and guild halls clustered at either end, turning riverbanks into centers of economic activity. Some cities owe their very existence to the location of a bridge, flourishing because a curve of stone created a new pathway through the world.
But the arch was not only a practical tool, it was a symbol of trust. To walk onto a bridge was to step onto a structure that united two places, two communities, two identities. Every arch beneath your feet reassured you that the journey ahead was possible. In times of peace, bridges brought people together. In times of conflict, they became strategic prizes or tragic casualties, their destruction symbolizing division as powerfully as their construction had symbolized unity. Over time, the arch's role in bridge building evolved alongside advances in material science. With the introduction of iron and later steel, builders could span greater distances with fewer arches. Yet even these newer bridges retained some memory of the ancient curve. Steel arches, sleek and elegant, rose across rivers and canyons, demonstrating that the principle of compression and the aesthetic appeal of the curve remained timeless. Modern arch bridges, whether carved from stone, forged from steel, or molded from reinforced concrete, continue to honor the same logic that guided ancient masons. The forces still flow downward and outward. The structure still grows stronger under load. The arch has proven so efficient, so elegant, and so universal that it persists even in a world filled with new materials and technologies. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the arch in bridge building is not structural, but metaphorical. Bridges are symbols of connection, possibility, and progress. They represent humanity's desire to overcome obstacles and reach beyond familiar boundaries. And at the heart of these symbols lies the arch, a shape capable of turning emptiness into opportunity. Through the centuries, bridges have served as stages for countless human stories. Pilgrims crossing remote spans on spiritual journeys, traders carrying silk, spices, books, and ideas, lovers meeting midway between their hometowns, soldiers marching across to war, and refugees fleeing conflict in the opposite direction. Bridges have witnessed the full spectrum of human experience, standing silently as history has unfolded across their curves. In this way, the arch returned to its earliest purpose, not just supporting physical structures, but shaping lives. Each arch held the weight of countless footsteps, conversations, ambitions, and dreams. Each bridge connected more than land, it connected people, cultures, and destinies. As we move forward in the story of the arch, we see how this ancient shape continued to evolve with human innovation. The arrival of iron, steel, and new construction techniques would challenge the dominance of stone arch bridges, giving rise to new forms. Yet even as technology marched on, the arch endured, adapting to each new chapter of architectural history. In the next chapter, the arch enters the industrial world, reborn in iron and steel, ready to transform once again, this time into a symbol of modern ambition. For thousands of years, the arch had been carved from stone, shaped by hand tools, and lifted into place by sweating workers, guided more by intuition than formula. It stood in aqueducts, cathedrals, and bridges as a testament to the patience and craftsmanship of ancient builders. Yet, as the world approached the dawn of the industrial age, something shifted. The rhythm of human progress quickened. Machines began to roar where silence once prevailed, and ironworks glowed in the night like new suns. Humanity was preparing to rebuild its world, not slowly, but with explosive speed. And in this tumult of innovation, the arch was not left behind. It was reborn.
The Industrial Revolution cracked open possibilities that earlier ages could scarcely imagine. For the first time, builders were no longer restricted to the weight and limitations of stone. Iron, stronger, lighter, and more malleable, offered new horizons. Steel, emerging shortly after, expanded those horizons even further. These materials transformed the very language of engineering, and with them, the arch evolved from an ancient craft into a modern science. Yet even as iron and steel rose to prominence, the principles of the arch remained unchanged. The forces of compression still flowed through curved forms. Weight still traveled downward and outward. Stability still came from harmonious distribution of pressure. The old lessons of stone arches, those learned in dusty Roman quarries and under Gothic vaults, became the foundation for a new era of structural daring. This transition began modestly. In the early 18th century, ironmasters experimented with casting curved ribs capable of supporting loads far greater than stone ever could. No longer limited by the need to quarry perfect blocks or carve precise wedges, engineers could now forge repeating shapes with mechanical accuracy. Iron arches could be thinner, wider, and infinitely more adjustable.
They could span distances that stone would have crumbled under. They could bend without breaking. One of the earliest and most iconic examples of this transformation was the Iron Bridge in Shropshire, England, completed in 1779. It was a bold gamble, forged entirely from cast iron at a time when no one had ever attempted such a thing. When the scaffolding was removed and the arch held, the world changed. Here was proof that ancient geometry could be fused with modern material to create something entirely new. The Iron Bridge stood like a metallic echo of Roman engineering, yet it was not Roman at all. It was modern, sleek, precise, and strong in ways stone could never be. As ironworks expanded, bridge builders pushed themselves further. Designers realized that iron arches could be assembled from prefabricated sections, manufactured off-site, transported by river or rail, and bolted together with unprecedented efficiency. Previously impossible spans suddenly became achievable. Rivers that once required multiple stone arches could now be crossed with a single sweeping iron curve. Transportation networks expanded rapidly. Trade intensified. Cities grew into industrial giants. Railways, the arteries of the industrializing world, demanded bridges that could withstand the immense loads and vibrations of locomotives. Stone arches, magnificent as they were, could not endure the dynamic stresses of engines thundering across them. Iron arches, however, thrived under such pressures. They flexed slightly under load, absorbing shocks rather than resisting them. The arch's ancient principle of force distribution became essential to a world that was moving faster than ever before. But the revolution did not stop with iron. By the late 19th century, steel emerged as a superior material, stronger, more flexible, and more reliable. Steel arches could span greater distances with less material. They could soar higher, endure harsher conditions, and integrate with new construction methods that reshaped everything from bridges to skyscrapers. The arch, once grounded firmly in the earth, now reached into realms once reserved for imagination.
Consider the steel arch bridges that came to define the modern age. Structures like the Hell Gate Bridge in New York or the Sydney Harbour Bridge in Australia displayed sweeping curves that transcended function and entered the realm of iconic design. No longer simply supports for roads or railways, these arches became symbols of national identity and technological triumph. Their silhouettes decorated postcards, posters, and the dreams of engineers around the globe. Yet these grand arches were not merely monuments. They were vital links in the infrastructure of an expanding world. Railways and highways snaked across continents, connecting distant cities, cultures, and economies. Goods could now be transported with unprecedented speed. Migrants traveled in search of new opportunities. Armies moved swiftly across vast territories. The arch supported this movement, quietly, reliably, and elegantly. At the same time, the industrial age introduced a new form of the arch, the reinforced concrete arch. Combining steel's tensile strength with concrete's compressive power, this hybrid material opened pathways to even more ambitious designs. Builders could mold concrete into any curve they desired, allowing arches to take on sweeping, fluid shapes that looked almost sculpted by nature. Bridges like the Salzgitter in Switzerland showcased this new aesthetic, slender, graceful, yet incredibly strong. Reinforced concrete arches became the backbone of modern infrastructure. They supported dams, tunnels, overpasses, water channels, and public buildings. Their flexibility allowed designers to incorporate art into engineering, creating structures that blended seamlessly with landscapes. The arch, once heavy and massive, became light and elegant. But perhaps the most profound evolution of the arch during the industrial era was conceptual rather than structural. Engineers began to see the arch not just as a physical form, but as a principle, a way of understanding how forces moved through materials. This principle could be applied even in structures that didn't look like arches.
Suspension bridges, for instance, use cables to create invisible curves that behave like inverted arches. Skyscrapers, with their load-bearing frames, rely on arches hidden within their internal structures. Even aircraft hangars, stadium roofs, and modern tunnels borrow from the same geometries that defined Roman aqueducts. In this sense, the arch became omnipotent even when it was invisible. The industrial rebirth of the arch also transformed the way people perceived architecture. No longer confined to sacred or monumental spaces, arches became everyday experiences. Millions of commuters passed beneath them on their way to work. Freight trains thundered across them, carrying the weight of entire economies. Travelers gazed up at their sweeping curves as they drove along highways that cut through mountains and valleys. The arch had become part of daily life, a quiet reminder of the ancient ingenuity that still shaped the modern world. Yet, despite all this progress, the industrial age maintained a reverence for the arch's origins. Engineers looked back to the Romans not as relics of a lost world, but as colleagues separated by time. They studied ancient ruins to learn how arches weathered centuries of pressure. They marveled at structures that still stood despite lacking modern tools or materials. And in many ways, they recognized that the arch's longevity lay not in cultural achievement, but in universal mathematics. What made the arch powerful in ancient Rome made it powerful in industrial Europe: the harmony of compression.
Even as steel frames and suspension cables rose to prominence, the arch remained one of the most trusted forms in engineering. Its principles were never outdated. They simply evolved. Today, we live in a world shaped by the legacy of the industrial arch. We cross its bridges without thinking, rely on its tunnels without noticing, and admire its silhouettes without realizing we're admiring an idea thousands of years old. The arch's rebirth during the industrial age ensured that it would never be left behind. Instead, it became a bridge not only between landscapes, but between eras, carrying humanity from ancient ingenuity to modern innovation. As we prepare to enter the final chapter of this story, one truth becomes clear. The arch has always been more than a shape. It has been a companion to human progress, adapting to every age, material, and aspiration. And its legacy continues into the present and the future, proving that some ideas are not bound by time. In the next chapter, we explore the arch's enduring influence, its transformation from ancient discovery to universal architectural language, and its role in shaping the world of tomorrow. The arch began as a simple solution to a simple problem: how to span a space without collapsing under the weight of stone. But across thousands of years, it transformed into something far greater than an engineering trick. It became a thread woven through the entire human story, a shape that witnessed the rise and fall of empires, carried water and armies, lifted cathedrals toward the heavens, and forged bridges between worlds. And now, in the age of steel, glass, and machines that fly, the arch continues to guide us in ways both visible and hidden. It is an ancient whisper still heard in modern skylines. Today, when we walk through a city, we do not always notice the arches around us. They frame entrances to museums and libraries. They support the vaults of train stations and the spans of railway bridges. They appear in the curved beams of sports arenas and the steel ribs of massive hangars. Sometimes they stand openly. Sometimes they are buried deep within walls and foundations. Even when invisible, their logic remains the backbone of modern architecture. The arch has become so integrated into our built environment that we often forget its origins lie in the hands of ancient masons stacking stones under the open sky.
But the true legacy of the arch is not its shape, it is its idea. Its power lies in a single revelation. Strength does not come from resisting force, but redirecting it. This principle revolutionized architecture, influenced engineering, shaped design philosophies, and ultimately changed how humans approached problem-solving itself. Many modern structures imitate the arch without appearing curved at all.
Skyscrapers rely on internal load distribution systems that mirror the way arches channel weight. Suspension bridges use cables to create invisible arcs of tension. Even rockets and spacecraft use shell designs inspired by compressive geometries that echo the ancient curve. In some ways, the arch has transcended material. It has become a pattern of forces, a blueprint for stability, a philosophy of balance. Yet even as its invisible principles spread through engineering, the visible arch remains deeply symbolic. Governments still build monumental arches to mark important events. Cities erect gateways to welcome travelers. Architects incorporate curves to evoke continuity, unity, or aspiration. The arch continues to frame experiences, shape emotions, and guide the eye upward toward possibility. Consider the domes that crown modern capitals, museums, and universities. Each dome is a descendant of the Roman arch, a curved structure expanded into three-dimensional grace. These domes house legislative debates, scientific exhibits, and cultural treasures, carrying forward the ancient relationship between architecture and identity. The arch, in its domed form, still conveys authority, permanence, and enlightenment. Meanwhile, in the world of infrastructure, massive concrete arches stretch across rivers and canyons, supporting highways where millions of vehicles pass each day. High-speed trains race across arched viaducts. Pedestrian bridges curve gracefully across urban rivers. Even underground subway tunnels echo the Roman vault, shaped in arches that hold back the weight of entire cities. And beyond Earth, the principles of the arch have found their way into visions of our cosmic future. Architects imagining lunar bases or Martian habitats often rely on domed and vaulted designs, not for aesthetic nostalgia, but because arches distribute pressure evenly in environments where atmospheric forces differ dramatically from our own. On the Moon, where gravity is weaker, arches can span greater distances with less structural stress. On Mars, where atmospheric pressure would crush conventional shapes, the arch offers a resilient form capable of withstanding external force without buckling inward. In this sense, the earliest builders, those who carved primitive arches from clay and stone, unknowingly contributed to the architecture of future worlds.
The arch endures because it mirrors something fundamental about nature. Trees distribute forces along curves. Mountains rise in sweeping arcs. The shells of animals, the human rib cage, even the orbits of planets, all follow natural curves that distribute stress efficiently. The arch, far from being a human invention, is humanity's recognition of nature's geometry. We did not create it. We discovered it, honored it, and applied it. This discovery shaped entire civilizations. Rome used the arch to hold up an empire. Medieval Europe transformed it into a symbol of spiritual aspiration. The industrial world reshaped it in iron and steel, pushing it across wider spans to bind continents. And today, its principles guide everything from architecture to aerospace engineering. Few inventions in human history have traveled so far or lasted so long. But the arch's legacy is not merely structural, it is philosophical. It teaches resilience through cooperation. No single stone in an arch bears the full burden. Each stone supports its neighbor, and together they form a unity stronger than any individual component. In this sense, the arch reflects a profound truth about human societies. Cooperation, alignment, and balance create strength, not isolation or resistance. The arch embodies this truth in every curve, reminding us that stability arises from working with forces, not against them. Moreover, the arch teaches patience. Unlike the immediate assembly of steel frames or prefabricated concrete blocks, ancient arches required time, careful shaping, precise alignment, and slow construction supported by temporary scaffolding. The moment when the centering was removed, when the arch either stood or fell, was a moment of anticipation and trust. This ritual taught communities the value of long-term vision and the importance of craftsmanship. Even today, when building technologies move faster than ever, the arch reminds us that the most enduring structures are built with care. The arch also teaches humility. To stand beneath the Pantheon's dome or beneath a Gothic cathedral's vaults is to feel small in the presence of something far larger than oneself, not in a way that diminishes, but in a way that inspires. The arch creates spaces that evoke wonder, that invite contemplation, that remind us of the brilliance and bravery of those who built before us. It connects generations across time, giving each era the sense that it is part of an ongoing story. This story, stretching across millennia, continues today. Architects and engineers experiment with new materials, carbon fiber, composite polymers, 3D printed concrete, and yet many still return to the arch. They explore how its geometry can be optimized through computer modeling, how its forces can be analyzed through digital simulations, and how its shape can be reimagined in forms never before possible. The arches of the future may be lightweight, translucent, or adaptable. Some may unfold in space, others may shift shape in response to environmental conditions, yet all will borrow from the same timeless logic. In cities of the future, arches may play roles we cannot yet imagine. They may support vertical gardens, anchor floating structures, or serve as frameworks for renewable energy collectors. They may be embedded into the infrastructure of megacities, carrying data, water, and transportation systems in complex networks of curved pathways. As urban landscapes grow more vertical and interconnected, the arch may evolve again, subtly, invisibly, yet undeniably present. In this way, the arch's immortality is not merely structural, it is conceptual. It remains with us because it works, it resonates, it solves problems, it inspires beauty, it carries meaning, it embodies efficiency and elegance simultaneously. And perhaps most importantly, it reflects humanity's ability to learn from the world, adapt ancient wisdom, and apply it to new challenges. From the earliest mud-brick arcs to the towering steel spans of the modern world, from Roman aqueducts to spacecraft habitats, from city gates to cathedral vaults, the arch has shaped our past and guides our future. It is a reminder that innovation is not always about new inventions. Sometimes the most powerful ideas are those that endure, those that adapt, evolve, and continue to serve us long after their origins are forgotten. The arch is one such idea, a permanent curve in the story of civilization, a bridge between ages, a silent companion in humanity's greatest achievements. And as long as humans continue to build, dream, and reach upward, the arch will remain with us, supporting our world today and shaping the worlds we have yet to imagine.